I am called the widow of Nain, and this is my story. The sun had no right to shine that day. It pressed down on my shoulders like a hand I didn't want, warm and indifferent, as if the world had not just collapsed beneath my feet. The road out of the city gate was pale with dust, and every step I took stirred little clouds of it that clung to the hem of my robe and settled on my sandals. Dust on everything. Dust in my throat. The kind of dry, ancient dust that makes you feel like the earth is already practicing for what comes next, for the burying. I could smell the spices the women had wrapped him in, myrrh and aloe, heavy and sweet and wrong, because that smell belonged to other people's sons, other people's grief, not mine, not him. His name was Daniel. I won't keep calling him my son, as if he were a category, a role, a character in someone else's story. He was Daniel. He had a laugh that started slow and then took over his whole face, eyes disappearing into it, cheeks rounding like a boy half his age. He argued with me about the bread, said I added too much salt. He was right. I always added too much salt, and I would give anything, to stand in that kitchen again and argue with him about it. He was all I had left. That's not a figure of speech. That is the plain, terrible arithmetic of my life. His father, my husband, had gone into the ground 3 years before, and I had learned then what grief smells like up close. Like wood smoke that won't leave your hair. Like a cold room. I had survived it because Daniel was still there, still filling the house with noise and breadcrumbs and that ridiculous laugh. He was the reason I got up, the reason I lit the lamp, the reason the word tomorrow still meant something to me. And then the fever came. It did not ask permission. It did not give me time to prepare. 3 days, that's all it took. 3 days of watching him burn from the inside, of pressing cool cloths to his forehead that turned warm within seconds, of talking to him even when he stopped answering, because silence felt like surrender. I talked to him about the weather, about the neighbors, about anything that sounded like normal, like the world was still the world. On the 4th morning, the house was quiet in a way that had no bottom. I remember sitting beside him and not being able to move, not crying. I want to be honest about that. People expect crying, but in that moment I was simply empty, like a water jar that had been tipped over and left. The hollow ache inside my chest was so complete that it almost didn't hurt. Almost. Then it hit me in waves. A pain that wasn't sharp but crushing, like something enormous pressing down on my ribs from the inside, and I couldn't get enough air, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking no matter how tightly I pressed them together. That is what people don't tell you about loss. It doesn't just live in your heart, it lives in your hands. Now we were walking. The procession moved slowly, the way these things always do, with the weight of the bier carried by men whose faces were set and solemn. Neighbors, friends, people who had known Daniel since he was small enough to carry. Some of the women wept openly, their wailing rising and falling in that ritual way. And I do not say ritual to dismiss them. Their grief was real, but mine was something different. Mine had gone past weeping into a place that had no sound. I walked behind the bier. I kept my eyes on it. I could not look at the people around me. Every sympathetic face felt like a small wound. Every hand on my arm, gentle, well-meaning, made me want to step backward out of my own skin. I didn't want comfort. Comfort implies that there is a wound that can eventually close. What I felt was not a wound. It was an absence, a Daniel-shaped hole in the center of my life that no amount of kind words could fill. I kept thinking about practical things, the way the mind does when the heart is too overloaded to function. Who would carry water from the well? Who would repair the roof before the rains? I had no brothers, no father living. In our world, a woman without a man in her household is a woman balanced on the edge of a cliff, and I had just lost my last anchor. The grief was enormous, but under it, threading through it like a cold current, was fear. Plain, humiliating, practical fear. What happens to me now? I hated myself for thinking it, standing there walking behind my son's body, and part of my mind was already calculating survival. I felt ashamed of it. I still feel ashamed of it. But I think that is one of those things nobody says out loud. That grief and fear arrive together. That you can love someone with everything you have, and still in the same breath, be terrified of what their absence means for you. The two feelings do not cancel each other out. They occupy the same space, pressing against each other, and you carry both without knowing how. The gate of the city was behind us now. The road stretched ahead dry and pale, leading toward the place where the dead are laid. I had walked this road before, 3 years ago, following another bier. I knew what came next. The prayers, the stone, the long walk home to a house that would feel 3 times its actual size because of the silence in it. I was so deep inside myself that I almost didn't notice when the procession stopped. There was a disturbance, a different kind of movement ahead, a crowd coming from the opposite direction, travelers coming in toward the city. I looked up, irritated in that dull, exhausted way you can be irritated when you have no energy left for anything, and the world keeps interrupting anyway. The two groups were meeting in the road, and someone was at the front of the crowd coming toward us. A man. I don't know how to explain what I noticed first. It wasn't anything dramatic. He wasn't glowing. There was no thunder. He looked from a distance like a man, dusty from the road, the way everyone was dusty, with people pressing close around him the way they do around someone worth following. But he stopped. He looked at me. Not at the procession, not at the bier, at me. And something about the quality of that look broke something open in my chest that I hadn't even known was still sealed. It wasn't pity. I knew what pity looked like, and I had been drowning in it all morning. This was something else, something that saw me. Not the grieving widow, not the social problem, not the woman who needed to be managed and sympathized with. Me. The woman who added too much salt to the bread and had spent 3 nights not sleeping and had been doing arithmetic about water jars in her head while walking behind her dead son. He said, "Do not weep." Under any other circumstances, those words would have made me angry. Do not weep. As if weeping were the problem. As if I could simply choose to set it down like a heavy basket. But the way he said it, I cannot explain the way he said it. It didn't sound like a command. It sounded like a promise. Like someone saying, "Do not be afraid," not because there is no danger, but because the danger has already been handled by someone who knows what they're doing. I didn't understand it. I still didn't understand when he walked toward the bier and touched it, which no one did, which made the men carrying it stop in their tracks, frozen. He spoke to my son. He said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." The words were quiet, confident in a way that had nothing to do with volume, the kind of certainty that doesn't need to raise its voice, because it already knows the answer. What happened next, I cannot describe in a way that will satisfy you, because the honest truth is that my mind refused to process it in real time. There was movement where there should not have been movement. There was sound, a breath, a shifting. And then Daniel sat up. Daniel sat up. He looked around the way you look when you've been asleep and you're not sure where you are. Confused, present, alive. And then he spoke, and his voice was the same. The same voice that argued with me about the salt in the bread. The same voice that laughed until his eyes disappeared. The man took his hand and gave him back to me. That is the only way I know to say it. He gave him back to me, like returning something that had been borrowed. Like he had always had the authority to do so, and had simply been waiting for the moment. I have thought about that moment every day since. Not just the miracle, the look that came before it. The way he stopped for me specifically, in the middle of a road in the middle of the day, with crowds pressing on both sides. He did not have to stop. There was no request. I had not even looked up yet. But he stopped, and he looked at me, and he did not weep with me. He wept for me, and then he changed the thing that was making me weep. Here's what I believe now, having lived inside this story. There is a grief so total that you stop asking for help. You stop believing help is even possible. You walk in a procession toward the unavoidable end, and you put one foot in front of the other, because that is all there is left to do. That is where I was. And still, someone stopped. I think that's true for more people than just me. I think there are men and women walking through every kind of procession right now, behind the bier of a marriage, of a dream, of a version of themselves they cannot get back. And the road is pale and dusty, and the sun has no right to shine as bright as it does. But someone sees you in the procession. Someone stops. The scripture reference is Luke 7:11-17.